All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here in this session with us. This is session C1, Local Floodplain Management Initiatives. I'm the moderator today. I'm Alex Van Pelt. I am the state NFIP coordinator at the Kentucky Division of Water. With this session, if you guys have questions as we go through these presentations, I recommend go ahead and asking your questions early. Don't wait till the end. That way, we can have several lined up for the speakers as they become available. So our first our first presentation is going to be by Stefani Bell. It's titled Reimagining the City of San Diego's Approach to Floodplain Management. Stefani is a project manager for Michael Baker International, specializing in floodplain management, stormwater management, surface water resources, and water quality management. She has a BS in engineering from Virginia Tech and MS in engineering from NCSU. And Stefani moved to San Diego in 2016, where she works closely with the city's floodplain management team. With that, take it away, Stefani.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk today, Reimagining the City of San Diego's Approach to Floodplain Management. My name is Stefani Bell, and I'd like to take you on a little tour of Southern California. So check out these beautiful images. This place is spoiled with 146 days of sunshine annually, barely any cloudy days, and temperatures between 50 and 80 degrees all year round. I'm talking, of course, about San Diego, America's finest city. As I mentioned, I'm Stefani Bell, and I'm so fortunate to live and work in such a place. I'm a project manager at Michael Baker International in the Surface Water Department. And over the past few years, we've worked with the city of San Diego to enrich their floodplain management program and bring it to the forefront of the city's focus when it comes to hazard mitigation and planning. I would also like to acknowledge my colleagues over at the city who helped put this together. We have Eric Masalgo, a senior civil engineer and the city's floodplain administrator. Summer Hassanen, the assistant deputy director for transportation and stormwater department, the entity responsible for the floodplain management program, and Emir Williams, another senior civil engineer with floodplain management duties. So, a little more about San Diego. We're located in the farthest southwest corner of the United States between Los Angeles and the US-Mexico border. We enjoy moderate temperatures year-round and lots of sunshine. We get an average of 10 to 12 inches of precipitation per year, which falls during the months of October through April, which characterizes us as a borderline arid climate. So what are we doing at a floodplain conference? Well, there's a few factors at play. We suffer periodically from wildfires that affect the upper portions of our watersheds, and while we don't get much rain, when it hits, on top of the potential wildfire aftermath, we can end up with a pretty intense runoff situation, contributing to debris production downstream. We also have quite a bit of topography, which increases runoff and erosivity potential. Steep canyons and arroyos empty into alluvial plains, which have variable hydrologic responses and are difficult to predict. However, it does mean we have excellent hiking trails just a short drive from the city center and fantastic views of the skyline from the top of your favorite mountain. So the city has 6 major watersheds, with headwaters all in the Vulcan Mountains to the east, all draining to the Pacific Ocean. The local ecology, like most of Southern California, is desert scrub and chaparral, mostly drought-resistant vegetation. At over 26 miles of coastline, tidal marshes and canyons can be found, creating a transition from shallow marsh to imposing beach cliff. The city is also home to many listed endangered species of plants and animals, including many migratory birds on the Pacific Flyway, which is a real thing. Protected areas are designated as areas of biological significance, or ASBS, or environmentally sensitive area, ESA, which is somewhat similar to a coastal barrier resource system, or COBRA zone, that many of you might be familiar with. As a note, the city does not have any COBRA zones. So when we're not complaining about the weather, we're building. Land uses within the city limits are largely built out, with the highest concentrations of development downstream in the watershed, which is to set against their coastline. Some of this area is also reserved for our military, which is a large proportion of the local economy. Tourism is the next largest industry due to our expanse of beaches, parks, and the wonderful climate. San Diego County had over 32 million visitors in 2012 that collectively spent over $8 billion. And we're not just building, we're growing. At about 1.5 million people currently, that number is forecasted to increase to 1.9 million by 2050. This population increase is also expected to need more jobs and more housing, which those needs are expected to increase 25% and 19% respectively between 2020 and 2050. Which brings us to the floodplain. The city has over 35 square miles of special flood hazard area, including both coastal and riverine flooding sources. Mapped areas within the city include Zone A, AE, AO, that coastal VE, and X. The city maintains a municipal separate storm sewer system, or an MS4 permit. The whole drainage system contains approximately 50 miles of streams and channels, 20 miles of brow ditches and box culverts, 770 miles of storm drains, and 47,000 structures, including 5,000 outlets. Additional flood control is afforded by 11 dams, 4 of which are in the city limits. We also have 7 levee systems, 4 of which are owned and maintained by the city. At the coast, we're lucky that much of the shoreline is protected from tidal floods by lagoons, bays, and estuaries. However, this is in stark contrast to large cliffs or bluffs that, while they do provide elevation above storm surges, need to be carefully monitored for the public. So, who oversees all of this? As it pertains to managing the floodplain, the Transportation and Stormwater Department is responsible for managing all of the regulatory special flood hazard area, conveyance channels, and the MS4 storm sewer system for the city. So the mission of the Stormwater Department is to both protect water quality and provide safety from flooding. The 6 core principles are to provide flood-safe communities, look at stormwater as a resource, provide community benefits, protect the environment, utilize public partnerships, and ultimately provide clean, safe water. So TNSW is responsible for a number of assets to fulfill their mission. Hard assets include the conveyances, pump stations, and diversions, structural BMPs, and flood control structures such as levees and dams. To manage flood risk, TNSW conduct regular channel and pump station inspections and routine maintenance, operate tide gates during floods, complete storm drain repairs and replacement, manage stormwater basins, and are also stewards of the local habitat and migration areas. TNSW is also responsible for administrating the NFIP, which includes issuing floodplain development permits, completing inspections to assure compliance with the local ordinance, maintaining records of floodplain development, assisting with the preparation and revision of maps, and helping residents obtain information on flood hazards, map data, flood insurance, and to know the proper construction measures. So for the risk mitigation minded in the audience, there are many challenges for the city. While the rainy season is short and confined, these intense storms, plus topography, plus large amounts of built upon area, lead to a flashy hydrologic response, which can be exacerbated by side wildfires. Increase in population and housing demand also means less space for flood mitigation area. Aging infrastructure and undersized storm drains is pretty common to most MS4s, and San Diego is no exception. The city is over 100 years old, and most of our infrastructure was built post-World War II. Much of it is nearing the end of its lifeline and needs to be replaced, which, as you can see from the chart, is going to be very expensive. Building green infrastructure is also challenging, as the vegetation, which is crucial to the proper function of any green BMP, needs a consistent supply of water. Our climate doesn't really support that, and most, if not all, stormwater BMPs require some form of irrigation. We also have a lot of natural areas that need protection. Arroyos are steep-sided gullies formed by fast-flowing water in arid and semi-arid climates of the southwestern United States. They are susceptible to hydromodification, which is the attenuation of the natural flow of water through a landscape due to urbanization as a result of their steep slopes and narrow flow areas. Impacts of hydromodification are a general decline in the health of the watershed, seen as unstable stream banks, sediment erosion and deposition, and sometimes dangerous flow conditions. San Diego County is also at the top of the list nationally for our numbers of endangered plant and animal species. The variations in rainfall, temperature, elevation, and topography leads to an incredibly diverse plant habitat with over 1,500 species native to San Diego County. Many of these species are endemic, meaning they cannot be found in any other part of the world. The city therefore has a responsibility to protect this biodiversity for future generations. So historically, floodplain management has followed the traditional model of responding to claims and losses when they happen. As a participating member of the NFIP, approximately 3,020 flood insurance policies are active, providing coverage of up to $869 million. As of 2019, we estimated 652 losses and a total of $10 million paid. However, FEMA also keeps a record of properties that suffer from repeated flooding through their repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss program. The goal of the RL-SRL program is to provide funding for structures that continue to flood and have damages, and the eligible mitigation activities are either acquisition and relocation, elevations, or conversion to an open space. I have the exact criteria for what qualifies an RL or an SRL listed on the slide. As of 2006, there were 17 RL properties and 6 SRL properties in the city. Only 7 of these properties were insured. The capital improvements required to fix these areas are complex and extensive and a reflection of the challenges that I've previously mentioned. There are also many areas of the city that do flood frequently but are not mapped in the SFHA and thus are not insured. I'll provide an example of one such area later in this presentation. So the last community assistance visit occurred in 2018, and the city is working with those findings to strengthen the overall program. The CAV is a visit to a community by a FEMA staff member or the staff of a state agency on behalf of FEMA that serves the dual purpose of providing technical assistance to the community and assuring that the community is adequately enforcing its floodplain management regulations. Generally, a CAV consists of a tour of the floodplain, an inspection of community permit files, and meetings with local appointed and elected officials. If any administrative problems or potential violations are identified during a CAV, the community will be notified and given the opportunity to correct those administrative procedures and remedy the violations to the maximum extent possible within the established deadlines. This report for the city included a code compliance review and identified several non-compliant properties in the floodplain. Fixing these issues requires a long lead time and the dedication of resources to do everything we can to avoid enforcement action, but it is a last resort for both the city and FEMA. So with this growing list of issues, it's very challenging to keep up with maintenance. The O&M group worked very hard to keep the MS4 clean and clear, but it's often hard to get ahead of Mother Nature. A lot of burden thus falls on the O&M group to keep up with their growing list of tasks before they turn into full-blown projects. To complicate things further, they have to be vigilantly aware of nesting birds, removing that vegetative habitat, and also balancing wildfire risks. Many routine maintenance actions therefore require an environmental permit, which can delay action. So how do we take all of these challenges and turn towards a more proactive way of managing the floodplain? Well, the city has acted on some ideas. First of all, some good things came out of the CAV. We were able to work directly with FEMA and have a line-by-line code review and found that our 2-foot freeboard requirement gave a lot of extra coverage. So freeboard is the factor of safety expressed as the feet above base flood level that new or substantially improved buildings need to be elevated to. The 2-foot requirement is 1 foot higher than the NFIP minimum requirement. And as a result of that coordination with FEMA and also the Coastal Commission and council members, we were able to achieve a fully compliant code in 2019. So as I mentioned previously, the city has many areas that frequently flood, but the affected properties are not insured by the NFIP. One such area is described as Auburn Creek, which is a tributary to the Chollas Creek watershed that flows through most of the urbanized area of San Diego. The flooding affects residential structures, roads, and public parks. Also, according to a CDC reporting, this area was designated as socially vulnerable, with many families low income, either have English as their second language or at a secondary education level. Auburn Creek also shows signs of severe erosion caused by high velocity flows and restricted creek capacity along much of the stream corridor. As a result of the high velocity flow and active erosion, there is little vegetation along the stream banks. There are no stormwater quality treatment facilities in place, and illegal dumping occurs along this stretch, resulting in large amounts of trash and debris that exacerbate the conveyance problems. The city receives regular damage claims in this area, as none of the properties have flood insurance coverage, and most likely wouldn't be able to afford it anyways. So the city really wanted to help residents in this area, and then developed a revitalization plan to upsize the drainage infrastructure and turn floodplain area into a park that would also provide stormwater quality treatment. The Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC program, was rolled out in 2020 and identified as a potential funding source for the project. Unfortunately, time was not on our side to turn the revitalization plan into construction documents in time for the BRIC application deadline. We tried, but were ultimately unsuccessful. However, going through the BRIC process did require the city to complete the paperwork to take credit for our existing and very strict building code. We were issued a BSEGS rating of 2.0, which ultimately means that we can be eligible for additional and future grant programs through FEMA. We can also make progress towards better record-keeping efforts that will support future benefit cost analyses, an integral part of the BRIC application. So after the BRIC determination, we requested a debriefing with Cal OES, which is the Office of Emergency Services and the administrator for the BRIC program in California, to go over our application. Eventually, we decided that advance assistance was a possible path towards developing the project further. Advance assistance is part of HMGP, which means that funding has to be tied to a disaster. Fortunately or unfortunately, San Diego County is eligible for funding related to a wildfire disaster that occurred last October. So we decided to proceed with pulling together an application for advance assistance for Auburn Creek. Pursuing this and this program also has the added benefit of allowing us to take a step back to identify and engage stakeholders and provide public outreach to find a solution that the community is on board with. Environmental stewardship is a shared responsibility, and the city is always looking for opportunities to involve the public. Ultimately, the goal is a win-win for the city to reduce the number of flooding claims in this area and to keep the public safe. So I mentioned our coordination with Cal OES, but it doesn't stop there. We're also supporting FEMA with their efforts to restudy the San Diego River. We've been involved to help provide as-built, technical studies, O&M records, dam operation records, and served as a central point of communication with the neighboring cities. FEMA doesn't operate in a black box, and we found it very helpful to be involved in the modeling process to get an idea of what the map updates are going to look like and how to prepare to support the public. We continue to collaborate with the Coastal Commission, whose involvement was critical with our floodplain code update. And then we're also right on the border, so we need to keep in touch with the IWBC. We share the Tijuana River with Mexico, so this is an ongoing effort between the city and our neighbors to the south. Another really cool initiative was the MWMP. As most of us know, a storm drain system requires periodic maintenance to remove accumulated sediment, vegetation, and trash that impedes water flow and increases flood risks. The city developed a new Municipal Waterways Maintenance Plan, or MWMP, that guides maintenance of the storm drain system to more efficiently provide public safety through a proactive and responsive maintenance schedule that minimizes and mitigates effects on the environment and streamlines subsequent authorizations. This plan was developed through site visits and as-built easement research in high flood risk channels. These easements were digitized into GIS database for integration with other departments, such as environmental and planning and public works. The GIS tool for channel maintenance tracks, records, and notifies management of maintenance tasks to be completed. So the goals of the MWMP are to provide flood risk reduction, infrastructure sustainability, and resource protection and restoration. The programmatic citywide approach is preferred by regulatory agencies, which can streamline permit processing, provide consistent permit conditions, and make the process more transparent and predictable. Much of the effort towards developing and implementing the MWMP also addresses water quality. Pollution prevention activities such as street sweeping, drain cleaning, and maintaining retention basins contribute to the water quality goal of reducing sediment sources to the waterways. Some of the tracking measures can also be repurposed for water quality and habitat monitoring. So with all that, what does the future of the floodplain management program look like? First stop, everyone wants to be in the CRS. The community rating system is a voluntary incentive program that recognizes and encourages floodplain management practices that go beyond the minimum requirements of the NFIP. In some cases, communities are already exceeding the minimum requirements, but just need to complete the paperwork. The city does not participate in the CRS yet, but is actively pursuing this. The city's goals for the CRS are to provide a reduced insurance cost to its constituents in the ASFPM. The CRS provides a % discount on insurance rates depending on the level of rating achieved. The lowest class receives a 5% discount, but the highest achievable is 45%. This is an attractive option to provide some relief to those disadvantaged communities in the mapped floodplain. It is also a direct benefit to them as dollars in their pockets. In addition to discounts, the CRS will also provide technical assistance in designing and implementing flood fighting measures available at no cost to the city. We are also looking at becoming a cooperating technical partner, or CTP. The CTP program's mission is to leverage partnerships to support the risk map program, kind of share the load and allow communities to take ownership of their own flood map products. FEMA supports the CTP program to leverage community level experience, obtain data, and provide funding. By becoming a CTP, the partner formalizes its contributions and commitment to the program, ensuring better overall flood risk identification and community protection through the development of reliable and up-to-date flood maps and community outreach. The city is looking to leverage that partnership with the first step of obtaining funding to complete Clomer-Lomer reviews. A lot of the maps are outdated and rely on the Clomer-Lomer process for any updates. The overall goal is to complete our own data collection and eventually flood hazard mapping. So finally, we're looking into additional sources of funding. There are more areas like Auburn Creek that need support. Each time we go through an application, the process gets more streamlined. In the future, we'll look at this list of programs listed on the slide to align a specific project to the mission of that program and better ensure a successful outcome. So overall, the city's approach, besides just getting started, some tactics are to first take credit for what you're already doing. This is the low-hanging fruit that requires minimal effort to start realizing some benefits. Secondly, look for opportunities to cross-collaborate. Floodplain management is multidisciplinary and shares similar goals with other departments and regulatory bodies. And finally, take advantage of those FEMA programs. And don't be afraid to reach out to your state coordinators, as they're there to help. Even if one opportunity is unsuccessful, they're much better at navigating the ins and outs of each program and can point you to a better fit if you're willing to follow it through. So with that, thank you for listening to my presentation. I'd be happy to take some questions and hope you all have a good time at the rest of the conference.
All right. Great job, Stephanie. And thank you so much for being here with us today. It looks like we've got one or two questions in the chat box, but I'm going to remind everybody, guys, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in as soon as you think of them. There is a short delay from when I say something to when you hear it. So get your questions in sooner rather than later. So Stephanie, first off, in your opinion, when you arrived in San Diego, what was one of the biggest challenges that you and the city were kind of facing when it came to floodplain management, and how did you all decide to address that moving forward?
Sure. Coming from the East Coast and then heading to a totally different type of climate that is San Diego, I think a lot of times the challenge can be public perception in terms of how do you try to explain flooding when it only rains a couple times a year. So it can be difficult to place emphasis and resources towards that when the public perception is maybe that it's not such an impending issue. Additionally, when it comes to some floodplain management incentives, it can be hard to convince officials to take advantage of programs when there isn't necessarily a repercussion to be had. So for example, the CRS and the CTP are great programs to get involved in, but there isn't an immediate action to be called for, as in there's no like negative consequence for not participating in them. So when you're faced with a lot of challenges that you have already that you need to deal with, it can be difficult to try to push some of those forward. So again, going back to the reactive versus proactive for floodplain management approach, it's just a perception issue.
Okay. We've got a couple in the chat box. So great presentation. Can you elaborate on the coordination with other agencies such as county, CA, DWR, FEMA, i.e. status of future CTP and CRS efforts, and the IBWC?
Sure. So from the city's perspective, we've probably had the most coordination with FEMA directly, and that was as a result of the community assistance visit. It can be kind of scary from a floodplain administrator position when you get that CAV letter and start seeing some of the comments coming back, but it really did put the city in a better position in terms of managing their floodplain actively. For instance, with the ordinance update, that was really helpful to get everybody back on track. And then we did really come to discover that FEMA was there to help move things forward and to try to address some of the issues that we had with the CAV. Nothing was really from a consequence perspective. It was working with the city and trying to identify ways that we could help close out the CAV. It's still not closed. There's a couple of outstanding issues to work out with the public. People don't necessarily like to move towards enforcement, but it can be a long process, and that was something that the city and the public, I think, needed to be aware of. So yeah, and then I guess we do coordinate with San Diego County. They're our neighbors for the unincorporated areas. There's coordination with the restudy effort that FEMA is currently working on for the San Diego River.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So another question was, you mentioned the perception of flood risk. What were some of the things that you did to change public perception of flood risk there in the community?
Sure. So I wouldn't say that we would have a goal of changing public perception of flood risk. Their perception is what it is, but we may want to be more ready so that the perception is that the city is prepared for flood risk. So we try to do that through outreach efforts, working with communities, and through improvement efforts such as the Auburn Creek project, where we are trying to establish additional floodplain area and natural area that can be used for floodplain storage, as opposed to just letting that be developed, for instance. And there are other places throughout the city where they're looking for opportunities to do that as well.
Okay. What is your schedule for these program improvements, CRS, CTP, etc.?
Sure. So I can't comment specifically on schedule. That again is something that's decided on a city fiscal year level. However, I can say that we would like to accomplish these in the next fiscal year.
Okay. And then I think last question, CRS is a hard sell to municipalities that are not funded appropriately. How does one sell the concept? Scare tactics don't work. CAVs are attention getters. So what would be your recommendation to those communities? True.
And I recently had discussions such as this where the CRS is maybe put on the back burner. But I would say that in terms of going back to public perception, the CRS is the easiest thing that you can do to put money in people's pockets and to say that you've made a direct impact on the ground level. So while there's not an immediate incentive, it definitely relies on you to put it as a priority. It has a measurable impact.
Yep. Well, great job, Stephanie. We had several people in the comments also say kudos and great job. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And do you want to give a quick shout out to your contact information?
Sure, yeah. If anybody has additional questions, feel free to email me or any of my co-presenters at the city. We'd be happy to take any questions or give more thoughts and increase collaboration.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on, we're going to start with our next presentation. It is titled, How Strong is Your Local Floodplain Ordinance? Findings and Recommendations from the Red River Basin. Our speakers today are going to be Joe Waln and April Walker. Joe is a professional civil engineer and certified floodplain manager working at Barr Engineering Co in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He specializes working with communities to help them understand and mitigate their flood risk. Joe is also the webmaster and legislative committee chair for the Minnesota Association of Floodplain Managers. April is the owner of Walker Consulting. She is a member of City of West Fargo's Planning Commission and serves on the board of directors for the floodplain for the FM Area Foundation. Take it away.
April Walker and I will be presenting on findings and recommendations from the Red River Basin of the North, and hopefully provide some information for you to assess how your floodplain ordinance is doing and how you might be able to improve it. We'll begin with a description of the long-term flood solutions study created by the Red River Basin Commission, or LTFS, and the update that we've been performing over the past few years. We'll talk about how, as part of that update, we have reviewed ordinances within the basin and elsewhere, and finish up with findings and recommendations. The Red River Basin of the North is in the north central part of the United States. Most of the US portion of the drainage area comes from Minnesota and North Dakota, and the river serves as the state boundary between North Dakota and Minnesota. The river flows north into Manitoba, through Winnipeg, and into Lake Winnipeg. The long-term flood solutions update was organized by the Red River Basin Commission, which provided oversight and facilitation. Barr Engineering and A. Walker Consulting did much of the technical work for the update, but we also had significant support from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Local stakeholders have also contributed to the review and content, namely the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, North Dakota State Water Commission, municipal leaders, water boards, as well as some other consultants who have been studying retention options in the basin. Before we begin, I would like to thank our funding partners. Without their support, we would not have been able to complete the update or to bring you this presentation and share this information with you today. The long-term flood solutions study was first published in 2011, and it established goals for the basin for managing water and reducing flood risk. In 2014, progress report was published, and now that we're 10 years out, we are in the process of creating an update and additions to this report to advance it with better information and provide a status on how we are doing towards meeting the goals established in 2011. From those aspirational goals, the different communities in the basin have been looking at their flood risk, and there are lots of questions that people are asking. There's uncertainty about what climate will do to the region, and whether infrastructure is built high enough or large enough to withstand intense rainstorms, bigger floods. And these questions are one of the big reasons that we engaged in this update. The update to the LTFS involves several tasks. We are focusing today on task 4, which was the review of policy and regulation within the basin as well as outside the basin to develop recommendations on how floodplain ordinances and policy could be improved within the basin. In the United States, we have the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, that's administered by FEMA. The Red River Basin Commission straddles the boundary between Region 5 and Region 8. The focus of the update was on the counties and cities, primarily within North Dakota and Minnesota, although we did look at townships and tribes. When we get down to that local level, the counties and cities, we find that there are multiple approaches to floodplain management. There's different policy tools that communities adopt. Generally, states provide some sort of model ordinance, but after that, cities, they may adopt that model ordinance into their zoning regulations, but there might be other rules related to floodplain management in their stormwater rules or their building code, other policy documents. Sometimes the regulations reference these documents because it's easier to update those documents than it is to update zoning regulations, for example. So as we looked at the regulations in the Red River Basin, we asked questions or investigated these 14 different criteria. In our presentation today, we're going to focus on the bolded, or highlight the results from the bolded items on this slide here. But before we dive into those, I want to talk a little bit more detail about the basin itself and where we focused the updates. So Red River flows south to north from the northeast corner of South Dakota, and we focused primarily on the counties on either side of the Red River. That's where the majority of the population is and where most of the flood issues are. Those 12 counties have a population a little under 500,000 people. Within those 12 counties, there are 143 cities. Roughly 3/4 of that population are in urban towns or cities. The map on the right shows different color coding for the cities and counties, and the more green, the more recent their flood insurance documents are. Red and yellows, those documents are older. So the good news here is that much of the basin, at least along the Red River, have fairly recent FIS documents. Of those 14 categories that we looked at, the first 3 relate to how people are regulating development within the floodplain. So we found that the vast majority of communities are using the base flood elevation, FEMA's base flood elevation, to regulate development. That's a good thing. We found that the freeboard requirement for residential new construction varies from community to community, but there is general consistency. It's usually the BFE plus some amount of freeboard. And then third, most first floors or lowest floors are required to be at least 1 foot above that base flood elevation.
One of the interesting kind of anomalies that we found within the Red River Basin is that the Red River is a boundary water between the state of Minnesota and the state of North Dakota. So in the model ordinance for Minnesota, when defining a floodplain, generally you are allowed to use up to 1/2 foot of surcharge. And in North Dakota, you're allowed to use 1 foot. And so what we found is that the communities along the Red River, when they were updating their flood insurance studies, often had to negotiate what was going to be included in that document. And at one point on the river, you might find that they used a negotiated 9 inches, and they applied that equally to both sides of the river. And at other points along the river, you find that it was 6 inches in North Dakota and 3 inches in Minnesota that were used. And, Minnesota includes, as Joe was just talking about, in that RFPE, it is the base flood elevation plus 1 foot plus any surcharge. And so knowing what the surcharge was when your floodway was defined becomes very important in appropriately managing your floodplain.
The next item we looked at was watercourse setbacks. and namely, are there setback requirements in most communities? And we found there were some. The city of Fargo and Cass County both have a 100-foot setback from the floodway boundary. On the other side of the state line in Clay County, Minnesota, and there's a shoreland ordinance that does require some setback from waterways. In general, setbacks are not a very common regulatory tool by the communities, and we think that there's room to expand this practice to keep people further away from flooding sources. The next item, number 13, we looked at how consistent and common the regulations are throughout the basin, and running through the list here. So we talked about FEMA BFEs, that those are common and highly consistent. The floodway surcharge definition, as April just talked about, is common. There is a floodway surcharge, but it's not consistent, at least not across state lines. The regulatory flood protection elevation is commonly used, but it differs by state. The model ordinance adoption, most communities have adopted it, but sometimes those ordinances are outdated. The 1 foot or more of freeboard for low floors, that tends to differ by state. Where things are less common, it's less common for communities to regulate to events greater than the 1% chance annual exceedance probability. As we talked about at the beginning, one of the aspirational goals for the basin was for developed areas to regulate to a higher, less frequent event. The local ordinances are similar and current. This is one where it's not very common for the ordinances to be very similar, and oftentimes are outdated. And then we just talked about setback requirements not being very common. On this slide, we highlight some of those state differences in more detail. So we talked about that floodway surcharge being generally 1 foot in North Dakota and a 1/2 foot in Minnesota, but on the Red River, community by community or adjacent communities have negotiated different numbers, and so it's not a set number, which could cause some confusion. That regulatory flood protection elevation, that definition varies across state lines. Another difference is with model ordinances. North Dakota has a single model ordinance. Minnesota has 3 different model ordinances, one that has different flood overlay districts that are common in floodplain ordinances, but there are separate model ordinances it's a separate model ordinance, for example, is for communities that don't have a lot of development in the floodplain. Maybe in the future they could. So if they adopt a stricter, a stricter ordinance that doesn't allow any development in the floodplain, then they can avoid a lot of the problems that communities that are already built out continue to have to face. Setbacks, we talked about those differences in item number 8. Previously, there's some in North Dakota, and we have the shoreland ordinance in Minnesota. For fill limitations, North Dakota does not have a limitation. Minnesota limits fill in the floodplain to 1,000 cubic yards. And one thing that we liked about Minnesota's ordinances is that they do include natural beneficial use protection.
As Joe indicated earlier, when you're looking at a community's floodplain management rules, you might be pulling a little bit of information from the zoning code, and you might be pulling some information from the stormwater management code, or the water setback rules, or the building codes. And so one thing that we found that many of the jurisdictions, particularly those that have higher development rates, do is they have created some guidance documents to help kind of pull all of those sources of information together and make it easier for the end user to understand. So what you see here on the screen is an example of one of those. It's a document from the Minnesota DNR, that helps you try to visualize and understand what their rules really mean. You can see that it clearly shows that the lowest floor is required to be elevated on fill. It shows that that fill has to be at or above the BFE for 15 feet away from the structure. It shows you the regulatory flood protection elevation, and a lot of detail you can convey in an image like this. This is a practice that was not consistent throughout the basin, but was available in a lot of those areas where development is occurring, and something we think should continue.
One of the things that we wanted to check was what other communities are doing in relation to higher standards. And we found that many do regulate to higher standards. We've listed 4 examples here, but there are many others. The ones we're highlighting here: Harris County, Texas regulates to the 0.2% chance AEP or 500-year event. This was a response to the massive damages experienced during Hurricane Harvey. Cedar Falls, Iowa, they regulate to the 0.2% chance AEP plus 1 foot. They don't allow new lots in that 0.2% chance floodplain, and they also limit the amount of fill that can be put on a property to achieve a LOMR. One example outside of the United States is for Saskatchewan, Canada. They also regulate to the 0.2% chance event plus a half a meter. And the other part of their regulation that we wanted to highlight is that they use a different way of defining their floodway. They use a depth and velocity metric to define what areas are off limits for building and are reserved for the flood. The last example we want to share is with Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlotte-Mecklenburg County. They have, for some years now, been using local floodplain maps. So if you take all of the acronyms from FEMA and you apply them locally, a local BFE, a local floodway, a local floodplain, and by doing that, they're able to map future floodplain extents that take into account future development, even future hydrologic changes.
So moving now to what recommendations we're making moving forward. Joe told you a little bit about the model ordinance in Minnesota that says, hey, why don't you just prohibit development in the floodplain? And we think that's a great option, that in communities where you don't have a lot of development pressure, you have available developable high ground, this is a method you could use to really simplify the administration of your floodplain. And it does a great job of providing protection to those natural and beneficial uses as well. So certainly we would like to see more use of model ordinances that allow for that option. Increasing your freeboard requirements is something we're recommending. What you see here is just a snippet of a floodplain map taken from FEMA's Map Service Center. It shows you that this particular area, which is in Fargo, North Dakota, the West Acres area, if you're familiar, shopping mall, is in a part of the town that is considered protected by a levee. And so because it's protected by a levee, you normally would not, under the floodplain management rules, have to provide any additional elevation in this area. It's mapped outside of the floodplain. But you can see there by looking at the inset picture that in July of 2019, we had a rainfall here, and it was a rainfall where it was intense enough that the storm sewer system couldn't handle the rate of the water coming toward it. And so we experienced a lot of street flooding and a lot of the low areas filled up with water. So we call this pluvial flooding, when our storm sewer system is overwhelmed. If you're in a part of your community where meeting the minimum requirements for elevation requires less than 3 feet of fill, this is a good option to go ahead and increase that freeboard requirement so that even if your parking lot floods, like you see here in the picture, you can elevate the buildings to be high enough to be dry and not be at a threat from pluvial flooding such as this. This slide is actually going to cover 3 different recommendations. First is that you require a dry land access during a regional flood. The second is water course setbacks, and the third is to consider meander belt setbacks. What you see there is an example that will address all three of these recommendations. This is a community in Cass County, North Dakota. It was an area that was removed from the floodway by Lomer way back in the 1980s, and then houses subsequently developed there. The area shown as in red is the road, the access road coming into that area, and that's during a flood event when the road is actually flooded out. To the bottom of the screen, you see that area after a series of back-to-back flooding where Cass County came in and actually removed all of those houses through there. So this area, like I said, did not have a dry land access. It was not set back from the floodway. The homes were actually built on mounds that were lomered from the floodway. And it's out into one of those meanders of the river where the Red River is bending around the outside of the peninsula. So we can learn from this example where houses were built and subsequently removed and strengthen our ordinances to prevent this type of development from occurring so we don't have to buy it out later. This recommendation, we're pretty good about thinking about elevation changes and addressing those. We don't have a lot in our ordinances to deal with velocities. And we know that increased velocities increases the risk of erosion potential, and it provides added risk to people and to vehicles. So we're just suggesting that if you have the ability to do so, you take a look at prohibiting increased velocities and pay attention to the full flood regime characteristics when you're putting your ordinances together. This is an example of an area where the home was built prior to the addition of the accessory structure next to it, and in the interim between the construction of the home and the building of the accessory structure, the rules actually changed, requiring additional elevation. The difference there in the existing ground elevation and the building elevation is about 5 feet. Now, 5 feet is kind of a practical maximum in most areas. It's less efficient. You can see this is a pretty large lot, so it allowed this to happen here on this particular lot. But once you get beyond that 5-foot limit, typically the cost of that fill will go up. You might have to amend the natural soil by adding gravel or other materials that provide some strength, and you probably are going to have to compact it and lift as you build it. All of that adds to cost. In addition to the added cost, you lose floodplain storage. And so the recommendation here is that maybe in your community, there should be a practical limit to the amount of fill that's allowed to be used to make an area developable. And speaking of allowing fill, if you are going to allow fill, in particular, if you're in a high development area or an area that has a lot of pressure to develop, one tool that a lot of communities are starting to take advantage of is to require offset storage for any fill that goes in and impacts the floodplain storage. We are probably going to start to see a lot more of this as we move from steady state mapping to unsteady state mapping, and we learn what it takes to manage an unsteady floodplain. Another requirement, anytime a community rezones a piece of property, they have to notify people within a certain distance of that rezoning. We're suggesting here that if you are adding a development that has the capability or the possibility of increasing water surface elevations for existing homes, that perhaps it's just as appropriate to notify the adjacent property owners of that change in water surface elevation that is possible, and allow them the opportunity to weigh in on whether or not that development is appropriate. This recommendation, we're suggesting that you think about expanding the requirements that you use within your map special flood hazard area to a broader area. This is an example where the house you see was developed outside of the floodplain, but it's right along the riverfront. It's actually, I shouldn't say right along, it's quite a distance from the river, but it's a river fronting lot that was built in compliance outside of the special flood hazard area, However, you can see it was clearly at risk from flooding and ultimately had to be removed, bought out and removed by the city. And so um, perhaps expanding your zone beyond the requirement to elevate beyond the special flood hazard area, maybe across the street. That's something we would recommend that you look at closely and determine if there are options that work for you. We're recommending that the communities that have floodplain management rules, particularly those that are located in multiple documents or in different ordinances and different places, that you continue to use or you develop and use easy to understand graphics that help to illustrate the requirements of your community. We think that the adoption of model ordinances is great. We suggest that if you do adopt a model ordinance, you look at it periodically and check to see if it needs to be updated. Another thing that we propose is that as you're developing an update to your ordinance, try to consider those future conditions if at all possible. The whole reason that this particular study began was in response to questions that we were hearing from folks in our basin, and we don't think that's unique to our basin. We think that people everywhere are asking these types of questions, right? And so whatever you can do to consider future conditions in your current ordinancing is only going to make your community more resilient. With that, you can see here how to reach Joe or myself. If you have examples that we did not include that you think would be valuable, please feel free to reach out to us. We hope you're enjoying your conference, and we're glad that you chose to participate in our presentation today.
All right. Joe, April, thank you so much. Great presentation. I think it was very informative. We got several questions and only a couple minutes to get to them, so we'll dig right in. Many local floodplain ordinances allow for fill within the fringes, which means that some of the surcharge will be realized increasingly over time. Any thoughts on why FEMA doesn't make the regulatory BFE include surcharge from the model? My state's model ordinance does not have a surcharge addition.
It's a good question. I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is by adding that surcharge piece, because it's variable, you may have fill in the fringe that causes that surcharge eventually, or you may never get that fill. And so it adds complexity that I think makes FEMA want to leave that up to the states to decide if they want to include it or not.
Yeah. Great. Did communities report any specific challenges that prevented them from regulating to the 0.2% AEP?
Do you want me to take that one, Joe?
Sure.
Okay. Having my previous role was as the city engineer for the city of Fargo, and this Red River Basin is actually a very flat area where the river kind of spills out and gets very wide when it floods. I think there would be challenges because that 500-year floodplain footprint in our particular area gets very, very large, and it would be an obstacle for many of the jurisdictions that are located directly adjacent to the river system.
Great. I mean, that's a great answer. I think I run a problem here in Kentucky. Regarding compensatory storage, are there any long-term maintenance requirements to basically assure that level of storage is maintained over time?
Short answer is no, but the idea is that if you were to do something that filled that storage back in, that would be an impact to the floodplain, and you'd have to permit that.
Yeah. Okay. In your study, in this, April or Joe, either one can answer this. In your study, what was the thing that you found that really surprised you the most about this area?
From my perspective,
Go ahead, April.
you know, I really felt like many of the ordinances didn't have a strong basis for if a local jurisdiction decided to try and prioritize those natural and beneficial uses, they didn't have a strong basis to do that within their ordinances. And I think that's an area where there is a lot of potential for improvement, at least in the ones that I reviewed.
Joe, same question to you. Well, what surprised you the most?
I was pleasantly surprised at how many communities adopted model ordinances, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. You know, that ordinances are not necessarily fun to deal with, and so when the state provides a strong model ordinance, it's much easier for the community just to take that and say, yes, I'm going to use this. Maybe I'll tweak it a little bit. So I think it's a really powerful tool that is in our toolbox.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more as a state coordinator. Well, guys, thank you so much. Joe, April, thank you both for being here. Great presentation, and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving right along, we're going to just cut straight into our third and final presentation of this session. It's titled Structure Level Floodplain Analysis and Flood Elevation Points in Indiana. Our speakers are David Knipe and Marianne Cardwell. David is the section manager of the Central Basin team in the Engineering Services Center of the Indiana DNR at Division of Water. He is responsible for development and review of hydrologic and hydraulic models for various floodplain management and dam safety applications, and also manages Indiana's floodplain mapping program and the CTP program through FEMA. David currently serves as the co-chair of the Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee for ASFPM, and has been with Division Water since 1992. Marianne is a GIS project coordinator at the Paulus Center at IUPUI, focusing on environmental and disaster geoinformatics. She has 20 years experience in the GIS field and has been an analyst and programmer and manager. With that, take it away.
Good afternoon. We're here to talk about a project that we've been working on in Indiana, having to do with structural level floodplain analysis and flood elevation points. And this is a presentation given by myself, Dave Knipe at the Division of Water, and Marianne Cardwell with the Paulus Center. So first I want to go into some of the information that we have in Indiana. We've been working with what's called the Indiana Best Available Floodplain Layer, and that is a full-blown floodplain layer that is enhanced from the NFHL that everyone is familiar with. We've added a number of our own studies, over 18,000 miles of study, actually, that we performed in 2018, and that we're slowly getting into the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. But as you know, that takes time to do. But so in the meantime, we have the Indiana Best Available Floodplain Layer, and that's where we're working from. It does have flood information, base flood elevations, and floodway for most of the streams in the state. We're well over 85–90% coverage, and probably north of 90% now. Then there's a national flood hazard layer. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the NFHL, published by FEMA. It represents the actual FEMA flood insurance rate maps in a digital format with their viewers and all the information that goes with them. And that is used for insurance purposes. The Indiana Best Available Floodplain Layer is used more for permitting and construction, but the NFHL is for insurance. And in Indiana, we have 89 of 92 counties included. There are 3 that are not yet digital down the southwest corner of the state due to some very complex levee situations with those counties that are precluding us from getting them published. So in what we call NFIP, the Indiana Floodplain Information Layer, we have derived what are called flood elevation points. we did these back in 2008, 2009 when we introduced NFIP. And this was an idea so that we could do a determination of the base flood elevation for buildings, for development purposes, whatever you have. So, so what we do is we create a flood elevation point every 50 feet along the stream center line. And with that stream center line and those points, the user can select any point on the map and get to the nearest flood elevation point. That point that they choose does not have to be in the floodplain. It works outside the floodplain just as well as inside the floodplain. It's been a major benefit of having that is that we're not constrained to the floodplain when we do these determinations. But as we say, this project has we've spent some time looking at that logic in our studies. For the study we've done, we chose one county to work with, Clark County. Clark County is in southern Indiana, directly across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. So the Ohio River is the boundary that you see on the southeast side of the county. So the goal of the study was to do a couple different things. One, it's when we went to look at structural level floodplain analysis and take a good look at how we wanted to implement that in Indiana and push that idea forward. Since we have a lot of good data, it made sense to us to start really looking at a statewide structure level analysis. We wanted to review the flood elevation point technology and determine one thing we definitely wanted to do is include other profiles other than the 1% chance flood, which is what we have in our flood elevation points now. But we really wanted to look at that closely to try to work around some of the limitations of flood elevation points. And then we also wanted to look at grid solutions. Certainly FEMA these days are looking more at grid solutions and trying to determine how to derive base flood elevations and other elevations from those grids. And we wanted to take a good look at those to determine whether we wanted to switch to that solution or stick with the flood elevation points. So Marianne, I'll leave it to you to talk about the building outlines.
Yeah, so since we wanted to do the analysis on the structure basis, we needed some structure outlines and building outlines. One resource that's available for the entire nation is the Bing data sets, and that was generated from imagery. That really gave us a good place to start to do the analysis, and we were mainly interested in the buildings close to the SLFA. The problem with Bing is it's not always complete, and I'll show some examples next. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to complement the Bing data sets with some outlines that we would derive from a LiDAR data set. So as you can see here, there's a couple of examples of where the Bing data set is just not enough for us for this exercise. On the right-hand side, you can see a screenshot from Clarksville in southern Clark County. And the area that's outlined in pink is an area where we just don't have any building footprints for that area, even though those structures have been there for a long time. The other image on the bottom of the slide is from an area that is being converted from a highway to an interstate. I-69 is being extended between Evansville and Southwest Indiana to Indianapolis. And so we have areas here where a lot of houses have been demolished and there are some significant changes that are happening. One of the big downsides of the Bing data set is that, it's generated off of imagery, but we don't know with what year the imagery was flown. So the data could be fairly old at times, so we really have no way to know. The other advantage to doing something with LiDAR is we can actually look through vegetation and see structures that are under trees, for example. Next slide. So here's an example. You can see on the top left, there's a property that I've put an arrow towards, and you can't really see that property. So the pink outlines are the Bing data sets, and you can see that that house is missing. It's not a new house, it's just obscured by the vegetation. So on the top right-hand side, you can see the view of the LiDAR data, and there you can kind of peek through the vegetation and see the building structure. And that's a really significant advantage of the LiDAR data sets is as the light pulse is going down to the ground, it can give you multiple returns, including top of the canopy, top of the structure, and then maybe the ground as well. So what we did is we developed a procedure to extract the building footprints. And the first step to do that is to basically classify all of your LiDAR points as ground and building. On the bottom left image, you can see the points in red are those points, those LiDAR points that have been classified as buildings. And you can see the nice shape of the roof there. So once we have those building points identified, we can actually create the structures outline and create those building footprints, basically. And that's what you can see on the right-hand side is the building footprints that have just been extruded at a specific height.
Thanks. So I do want to spend some time talking about what we looked at for a new version of flood elevation points. Since we derived the original set in 2009, I've been keeping those and upgrading those to the present day. We have developed a lot of different data that could feed into a new way of looking at these flood elevation points. The big one is the National Hydrography data set. Indiana redid their NHD lines and published them with USGS. We did everything to at least a 1 to 2400 scale and up to a 6 acre drainage limit. So we have quite a bit of line work, really high quality line work that we're working with. And then we did a large study with USGS and a bunch of other partners on fluvial erosion hazards. And one of the big items that you need when you're looking at fluvial erosion hazards is a channel dimensions or estimated channel dimensions for what a stream might look like in the field, given it's in a natural state. So USGS has done a standard study where they do a regression analysis on measured values to derive channel widths and channel information for any stream given a drainage area. So, so that information is very handy. And then we did a ArcHydro study of the new NHD lines and derived a drainage area for each line segment in the data set, at least to a drainage area of 0.15 square miles. So we've got a pretty robust data set that gives us quite a bit of information that we can use to derive some good information. And then the new Zone A models that we created have the 5 standard profiles that you'd find in a FEMA study. And then we also have the NFHL data, which usually has 4 profiles, at least the legacy models. So for that, we are addressing that with another project that we don't have complete yet. We've just got to have it funded and are working on it now. So with this study, we're recognizing the fact that many of the FEMA models that are out there that are out of date are not NView compliant. We would like to update them, and we are updating quite a few of them, but that process takes forever. So we won't have that done in the next few years, but we need the information out of them, not just the the cross sections that are published, but the cross sections that are inherent in the models also. So we have initiated a project to research and derive cross sections for each model section or inflection point in the profile where we can. Again, some of that's going to be engineering judgment, but we've initiated that project, and so that feeds into what we do with the flood elevation points. We also want to derive the 4% profile, which is usually the profile that's missing in the flood insurance studies, at least the historic flood insurance studies, and then put that data into the FEMA standard geodatabase format. So with that information and with the Zone A information, all the other things that we have, we've derived what we call the new flood elevation points, and then working from this what we call wire diagram. So the first thing we do is we buffer each stream by 3 times that computed channel width. So the 3x stream is what we call that. With that, we derive a left and right point elevation center lines. So we have 3 center lines, the actual center line, and then 2 offset center lines, one to the left, one to the right. And then we're going to derive points on each of those center lines. We derive any missing profiles from the legacy model project that we talked about before. And we attribute each cross section from the FEMA GDB or from the Zone A models. So we have a complete set of cross sections, a complete set of profiles, and then we have the stream reaches, the 3 stream reaches. Then from there we review each cross sections, make sure that they cross each buffer line exactly once, so that we don't have conflicts with where the elevations are assigned along the center lines. And from there, we go ahead, and it's easy enough to run to put a point every 50 feet and derive the elevations from there. The key part here is that extra layer of points, the left and the right center lines, and the points on the center lines, minimizing the errors you have in finding the correct point. It was one of the weaknesses of the flood elevation points. Now they're fairly consistent, but they're not as consistent as we'd like them. And by putting this buffer on the points and deriving extra flood elevation points outside of the stream center line, we get much better results in finding the correct elevation for a selected area or selected point along the stream. One of the big benefits of the wire diagram is that they can be easily updated with new data and the flood elevation points derived from that. So if you do a LOMAR, if you do a new Zone A study, you can just swap out cross sections and then rerun the script that derives the flood elevation points. The FEPs are really easy to derive. Once you have the wire diagram put together, it's the wire diagram where the editing and all the review kind of happens. So you kind of get that base set, and then running the FEPs is fairly easy. It does not fully solve the issues with buildings being closer to the wrong point, but it goes a long way towards solving that issue. And I think we've gotten it to a point where we're pretty happy with the results. One of the goals of this project was to see if we could get these to a point where we could do an automated determination without any review of the points or of the elevations derived from the points. And I think we've gotten to that point, or we're close. But why don't we use grids? So FEMA, of course, is really gung-ho on using gridded information, and a lot of times it's great stuff. However, there's a few limitations. As I said, we looked pretty hard at grid solutions, and while there's some certain positives to it, there were a couple negatives that we really had concerns with. One big one is that for FEMA purposes, they require the grids to be clipped to the floodplain. And that's usually a pretty good idea because things can get weird when you work with tins and grids and those things within a GIS system. And without a lot of processing and review, you have to, there's a lot you have to kind of worry about there. So deriving them and clipping them is good for what FEMA's talking about, but then how do you evaluate structures outside of that grid? We've seen a number of folks come up with different solutions to that are very clunky and hard to implement. But most of the structures you're going to find, that's what people are looking for. There are a lot of structures out there that people have interest in knowing their flood risk for that are not within the 1% annual chance floodplain. As you see, 40% of NFIP claims are outside of the floodplain. Another issue with grids is that if you have new studies, if you have change studies, it's very hard to redo those grids if you don't have all the original information. Trying to patch grids together is always problematic. Interpreting backwater onto a grid and how you do that exactly is also something that's that can be very tricky to do. So with the flood elevation points, we kind of get around all that. It just kind of makes it a lot easier to handle the information. And then some of the other tin and grid functions can get kind of wonky, especially if you have two streams in parallel. Sometimes they get influenced back and forth if you don't put, a ton of break lines in your data, do that kind of thing. So we've decided to go with our new versions of the flood elevation points and work from there. Certainly, we'll keep our eye on grid solutions, and as the technology evolves, maybe we will look at that. Maybe as we get more into 2D solutions, which work exclusively with grids, that make more sense. But for now, we're pretty happy with our flood elevation solution. So to do our structure-based floodplain analysis, we looked at the each building either in a FEMA-defined flood zone or the best available flood layer flood zone, or within 15 times that buffer distance from the stream. So we made a polygon out of that one. Then for each building footprint that we've derived, we've determined the nearest ground elevation and the nearest flood elevation point. Ground elevation, of course, is from our LIDAR, and the FEP is from our analysis. So with that, we've determined a risk score. We borrowed these categories from our friends in Kentucky, south of us, but we do the criteria much differently. We are basing our criteria just on comparing that estimated ground elevation to the profiles. We do not do any analysis on the AAL or any of the cost values in order to kind of get away from the costing problems that you'll find if you're looking to price insurance. That's one thing, but we're looking to actually categorize the risk, and to do that, we want to kind of put the value of the building to the side, so that no matter whether you're in the poor part of town or the rich part of town, you're getting a good view of what your risk actually is. That, Marianne?
Yeah, so the way that we calculated what the difference in elevation was, it took us a few tries to come up with the right approach. But I think in the end, we came up with something that just made a lot of sense. It just took us a little while to come up with it. If you recall earlier when I described classifying the LiDAR points into ground or building points, this is where it becomes really important outside of just generating the building footprints. But what we did is for each vertex along a structure, so in the bottom left image, you can see the little circles at each vertex of the outline. We looked for the elevation from the LiDAR within a 5-foot radius, and we kept the lowest elevation for each of those points. And then for each point, we then looked for the nearest FEP point to that corner. And then we determined what the difference in elevation was between the two. So if you look on the bottom right, the point B, the closest one would be 469.11, but for point C, the closest one is 469.06. So we did this for every vertex of the building, and then we kept the one that had the largest flood potential for that building. So we did this on all of the buildings and then came up with the risk calculation. Next slide, please. So once we had that, we classified every building, and you can see the color coding here is based on that classification. That ended up, we kind of double checked it when we looked at the data to make sure it looked logical and it worked. But I think it's important to note that we assume that the damage happens when starting at the estimated lowest adjacent grade. One thing that we definitely would like to do in the future is to be able to research a little bit more how to determine the first floor elevation. Because right now we're just grabbing the lowest adjacent grade to each building corner, but it may be that the first floor elevation is higher than that, or it could be below that, depending on the structure itself. You could have a basement, you could have a crawl space, you could have an elevated slab. And those things are a little bit more difficult to tell via the LiDAR. We do have information attached to each parcel and the improvements and the construction that was done on each parcel. That tells us whether there's a basement or a crawl space or a slab. Unfortunately, it's really hard, almost impossible to link that information to a specific structure. So we ended up staying away from that and just using the difference between the lowest adjacent grade and the FEP. Or yours, Dave?
So for, as Marion was saying, we attribute each building with that estimated lag and the 5 profile elevations from the nearest FEP, and from there worked through the analysis to determine what the classification was. Pretty straightforward. So we can use this information for scenario and what if questions if we want to look at where we might be targeting various buyout targeting. We can use this information for that, or just informing the local officials that what the risk in their community is, so that they can determine what steps they may need to consider to mitigate that risk. Like I said, we did not use building value or damage loss curves as part of our analysis. We wanted a straight set of risk calculations that did not take into account the actual value of the building. But with this as a building block, that certainly can be done fairly easily if you're looking to use this data to cost out a project or determine what a buyout value might be. So with that is our presentation. So we are happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Great job, guys. Thanks, David, and thanks, Marianne, for being here for a few minutes to answer questions with us. We got one or two in the chat box, so we'll dig right in. Were there any significant disadvantages or limitations to using the LiDAR data in your analysis for the buildings?
There's a few that I can think of. The big one is how much space it takes. So for the whole state of Indiana, we're looking at about 15, 16 terabytes of data. So for a county, obviously it's a little bit less than that, but it can be, it's a memory hog. Additionally, if you recall earlier in the presentation, I said I had to classify the points. The points that we collect in Indiana did have the ground classified, but not the buildings. And so that added a few hours of processing time to do that. And then the third I can think of is we collect imagery about every 3 years in Indiana, but the LiDAR we collected between 2016 and 2020 for the whole state. And I don't know that there's an intent to collect it again in the near future. So the data may be a little bit more stale than using the latest imagery, for example.
David, with the tool, how does it incorporate any CLOMAR, LOMAR changes in on your analysis?
Yes, so that's one of the big advantages of it, is that when we get CLOMARs and LOMARs, and they happen everywhere, the program, everything is designed to take that information into the cross sections and and incorporate that into the flood elevation points a lot easier than you can with a grid. If you're working with a grid in terms of a LOMAR, you probably have a completely different spatial reference, completely different grid size. You know, everything could be different, and trying to manipulate that just adds a layer of complexity. With the flood elevation points, it just swap out the cross sections and rerun it.
Yeah, great. Can you explain further why you weren't able to utilize parcel data for determining the basement or slab on grade or other features on the buildings?
So the data, unfortunately, it's a great database, but it's all of the information is on a parcel basis, and it's really hard. You may have multiple structures on a single parcel, and it's very hard to determine which table row corresponds to which building. So that becomes almost impossible. Even as a human trying to match it up, it's hard, and then trying to automate it would be even harder. Maybe a computer would be smarter than I am, I'm not sure. But really, it's a disconnect between the number of improvements in these structures within the assessor's database that stores that information and the number of structures that we see on the parcel from the imagery or the LiDAR.
So one of the questions is, would it not be better and more accurate to map the geologic floodplain instead of limiting ourselves to the statistical model based on a statistically insignificant data set, i.e. the 1%? The geologic is all the flood risk area.
Well, in some ways we do that because the flood elevation points are not constrained to the 1% annual chance flood elevation area, and we do have the 5 profiles inherent in the points, so we're not constrained to the mapped floodplain. The geological floodplain, which is something that was mapped back in the 70s for some of the original dot maps in the original flood hazard boundary maps that were created, cause a lot of problems when you get into trying to determine elevations for those. And for better or worse, that's the way the NFIP evolved, is being reliant on those elevations and comparing your first floor structure elevations to a base flood elevation. And so while there's advantages of having a geologic floodplain or a one based on hydric soils, which we've seen in Indiana, folks try to do that. Program-wise, it becomes a real problem.
Great. With that, guys, I think we're going to call that our last question of the session. So David, Marianne, thank you again for being here with us today. Thanks for everybody for sticking around and listening to everybody. And thanks to all of our sponsors for helping making this virtual session possible. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you.